It was one of those rare summer days when even the bees seemed to hum in agreement that life, for once, had reached perfection. The lawns of Gossington Hall stretched in immaculate symmetry, their emerald surfaces broken only by white parasols, linen tables, and the glimmer of glassware catching the sun. Lady Bantry's annual garden party was the talk of St. Mary Mead, and perhaps, this year, even more so than usual. Word had spread that it might be her last. The lady herself, stately but fading, moved among her guests with a smile that had learned to endure the weight of gossip. Sir Henry's death 2 years ago had left her with the garden and the memories, both tended with care and equal melancholy. Yet today, as the orchestra played beneath the chestnut tree and the scent of roses drifted from the pergola, she seemed determined to play hostess one final time. Miss Marple sat quietly beneath a lilac umbrella, a cup of tea resting between her gloved hands. She was not one to impose herself upon grand occasions, yet Lady Bantry had insisted she come. For old time's sake, she'd said. From her seat, Miss Marple watched the small dramas unfold with a mild, knowing amusement, the curate's wife whispering too intently with the postmaster. Young Sylvia Trent casting furtive glances at Captain Denham, and Colonel Coles, sweating under his medals, refilling his glass for the 3rd time. Human nature, Miss Marple thought gently, was much the same in every garden. Only the setting changed. The laughter swelled when Lady Bantry rose to make her little speech, a sentimental farewell to her husband's rose gardens and to the village that had been her world. Yet before she could finish her toast, a startled cry came from the far end of the lawn. A maid, pale as the linen cloth, stood trembling beside the lily pond. The music halted. The guests turned. Floating amid the white water lilies was a figure in a pale summer dress, her golden hair fanned like reeds in the still water. For a moment, the scene was so serene that it almost seemed beautiful, until the silence broke into gasps and the glass slipped from Lady Bantry's trembling hand. Miss Marple did not move at once. She merely blinked, as though adjusting to a detail in the light. A garden party, she thought, was such an unfortunate setting for death, and yet somehow not entirely unexpected. The initial moments after the discovery blurred into confusion, the sort of half-hushed panic that English decorum struggles to contain. A few ladies screamed, others turned away, murmuring prayers or excuses to fetch someone in authority. Colonel Coles stumbled forward, attempting to assert himself, but it was the butler, old Withers, who reached the pond first. He knelt, muttered something inaudible, and then shook his head. The figure in the water was beyond help. Lady Bantry stood frozen, her gloved hand clutching her pearls as though anchoring herself to some reality that was swiftly unraveling. When she finally found her voice, it trembled. "Someone must fetch the police," she said faintly. "Perhaps Inspector Slack. Yes, he would know what to do." The maid, still trembling, hurried toward the telephone inside the hall. Miss Marple had not risen. She watched the scene with the calm of someone who had seen human tragedy before and understood that its first expression was rarely its truest. Her eyes followed the line of the pond's border, the grass faintly pressed in 2 places, as though someone had stood and then turned back. It was curious, she thought, how even in moments of horror, people left traces of their private choices behind them. When the police arrived, a brisk young constable followed shortly by Inspector Slack himself. The garden was already hushed, the guests drawn into uncertain little clusters. Slack, as ever, was polite to Lady Bantry but impatient beneath the surface. He ordered the area cordoned off and the body retrieved. The woman was identified, to general shock, as Sylvia Trent, the pretty, restless niece of the local vicar, and one of the livelier guests that afternoon. Lady Bantry sat pale and shaking on a garden chair while Miss Marple hovered nearby, quietly observant. Sylvia had been laughing not an hour earlier, flirting harmlessly with Captain Denham and teasing the pianist over some tune from London. There had been no hint of despair, no sign of quarrel, and yet here she was, lifeless among the lilies. Inspector Slack took statements briskly, his notebook filling with contradictory impressions. Some said Sylvia had wandered toward the pond to admire the flowers. Others recalled she had gone to speak privately with someone, a gentleman perhaps. Miss Marple said nothing. She merely watched as a small object was lifted from the grass near the pond's edge. A delicate silver locket, its chain broken. Slack turned it over with his pencil, noting the initials ST on one side and a faded photograph inside. A man's face, half smudged by damp. The guests were excused at last, leaving Gossington Hall steeped in a strange silence. The parasols had collapsed, the music stand lay empty, and the roses swayed gently as if unwilling to acknowledge what had occurred. Lady Bantry insisted Miss Marple stay with her for the night. She could not bear the house without company, she said. And Miss Marple, seeing that her old friend's composure was fraying, agreed. Later, as the evening settled over the village and the constables' lanterns glimmered faintly beyond the hedges, Miss Marple sat by the drawing-room window. From there, she could see the pond in the dim light, a smooth, moonlit mirror that revealed nothing of what it had held. But in her mind, small fragments had begun to stir and rearrange themselves. Sylvia's laughter, the missing few minutes before the scream, the broken chain, and the curious look Captain Denham had cast toward the pond long before anyone noticed the body. It was, Miss Marple thought, precisely the kind of puzzle that pretended to be simple. And those were always the most dangerous kind. The following morning brought a brittle quiet to Gossington Hall, as though the gardens themselves were holding their breath. The lawns, immaculate the day before, now bore the faint tracks of policemen's boots and the memory of whispers that would not fade. Lady Bantry had not slept. She sat in her dressing gown by the window, her eyes swollen and her voice low when she spoke to Miss Marple over breakfast. The inspector had promised to return with news, though neither of them expected any comfort from it. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, her expression thoughtful. She had listened, the night before, to the faint hum of voices in the hall as the police made their inquiries. Captain Denham had been questioned at length, his flustered tone drifting faintly through the corridor, and young Mrs. Price Ridley, ever the eager gossip, had been heard insisting that Sylvia had received letters from London. The vicar, poor man, had arrived late, pale with shock and guilt, repeating that his niece had been cheerful that morning. People, Miss Marple reflected, were rarely honest about cheerfulness. Inspector Slack arrived shortly after 10, his hat in hand and his manner brisk. He apologized to Lady Bantry, then glanced at Miss Marple with polite tolerance, the way men often did when they mistook gentleness for irrelevance. He explained that the coroner's examination suggested Sylvia's death had occurred sometime between 3:30 and 4, likely from drowning. There were faint bruises on her wrists, however, consistent with restraint or a struggle. Suicide, he said flatly, was unlikely. Lady Bantry gasped, her hand fluttering to her throat. Miss Marple only nodded slowly. She asked very softly whether the silver locket had revealed anything useful. Slack frowned. The photograph, he said, was too damaged to identify, but it appeared to be of a man, perhaps in uniform. He added that Captain Denham had denied all knowledge of it, though his denial had been, in Slack's words, a touch too quick. When the inspector departed, promising to question the household staff again, Miss Marple asked Lady Bantry if she might take a walk through the garden. The older woman agreed, though her voice wavered with unease. Outside, the air was heavy with dew and the faint perfume of roses. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes passing over the pond, the gravel paths, and the chair where Sylvia had been sitting earlier that day. Near the yew hedge, something caught her eye. A single heel mark pressed into the soil, deeper than the rest, as though someone had stood suddenly still. She bent slightly, peering closer. The imprint faced the pond, but the ground beside it was disturbed, a faint scuffing that suggested haste or struggle. She straightened, her fingers brushing the edge of the hedge. A small torn thread clung to the branch, blue silk, faintly scented with perfume. She pocketed it discreetly before returning inside. Lady Bantry had been joined by the vicar, who was attempting to console her through his own distress. His words tumbled nervously, full of apologies for his niece's youthful indiscretions, a phrase that made Miss Marple tilt her head ever so slightly. He mentioned that Sylvia had been keeping company with a gentleman lately, someone not of the parish. That afternoon, when Inspector Slack returned for another round of questions, Miss Marple waited until he finished before speaking. Her tone was mild, almost hesitant. She asked whether anyone had checked the registry at the Crown Hotel in Much Benham. Visitors from London often stayed there, she said, and it would be useful to know if any gentleman had taken rooms in the last week, perhaps one with a military air. Slack looked at her for a long moment, the corner of his mouth twitching with reluctant curiosity. Then he nodded. He would make the call. As he left, Miss Marple's gaze drifted once more to the window, where the pond gleamed faintly through the afternoon haze. There was something about that patch of still water that spoke not of passion or rage, but of careful planning, and that, she knew, was far more chilling. By evening, a faint drizzle had settled over St. Mary Mead, softening the air and muting the colours of the garden into shades of melancholy. Lady Bantry had retreated to her room, leaving Miss Marple alone in the drawing-room with her knitting and her thoughts. The ticking of the long case clock was the only sound, steady and solemn, marking the slow passage of hours since Sylvia Trent's body had been carried away. The house felt altered now, emptier, as though some unspoken truth had seeped through its walls and refused to leave. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the rain-blurred window, to the faint reflection of the pond beyond. She could almost picture Sylvia there still, smiling, laughing, moving lightly through the roses with that youthful restlessness that never found rest. Poor child, she thought. Foolish, perhaps, but not deserving of such an end. The pattern was beginning to form, though faintly, like a piece of lace only half knitted. Inspector Slack returned just after 7:30, his coat damp, his expression a mix of irritation and reluctant respect. He had been to the Crown Hotel in Much Benham. Yes, a man had taken rooms there 3 nights before the garden party. Mr. Leonard Dane, registered as a commercial traveller from London. He had left the morning after the death without settling his full bill. The landlady recalled him as handsome, confident, and fond of attention, which, Miss Marple observed mildly, was often another way of saying untrustworthy. Slack continued, saying that among Sylvia's belongings they had found a note, crumpled, water-stained, and unsigned. It read simply, "Meet me by the lilies at 3:30. We must speak before anyone suspects." The inspector's tone sharpened when he read it aloud. "It's clear enough what that means," he said. "A secret meeting, a quarrel, perhaps an accident that wasn't one." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles pausing mid-stitch. "Perhaps," she murmured. "Or perhaps someone wished it to seem so." Slack frowned but said nothing. He had learned from experience that Miss Marple's perhaps were never as simple as they sounded. The next morning, the village awoke buzzing with rumour. Mrs. Price Ridley was already telling anyone who would listen that Sylvia had been involved with a married man, while the butcher's wife swore she'd seen a stranger near the post office earlier in the week. At the grocer's, the talk turned to the locket and the mystery of the photograph. Only Miss Marple kept her silence, though she listened carefully as she walked through the lanes, her parasol tapping lightly against the cobblestones. By noon, word reached her that Inspector Slack had traced Leonard Dane's train ticket. He had purchased it to London but never arrived. Somewhere between Much Benham and Paddington, the man had vanished. Miss Marple paused at this news, her eyes narrowing slightly. A man who ran from guilt rarely vanished completely. A man who wished to disappear, however, often planned his escape long before he was suspected. That evening, as twilight settled over the village, Miss Marple took a quiet walk back toward Gossington Hall. The pond was still cordoned off with a thin rope, a policeman stationed nearby to keep curious eyes away. She approached slowly, greeting the constable with gentle politeness. Her eyes moved over the lilies, fresh now after the rain, and the faint ripples where the water caught the fading light. Then she noticed something she had not seen before. Near the far end of the pond, half hidden by reeds, lay a broken branch of laurel with its leaves crushed and bent backward, as though someone had stepped there in haste. She bent slightly, careful not to disturb the ground. The mark beside it, long, narrow, and uneven, was no shoe print. It looked more like the edge of a walking stick pressed hard into the soil. Someone, she realized, had stood there not out of curiosity, but to watch. When she returned to the house, Lady Bantry was waiting, pale and restless, a letter trembling in her hand. It had arrived that afternoon, addressed to her late husband, but posted only yesterday. Inside was a single sheet, the writing hurried and uneven. Tell her not to speak to anyone. The truth is dangerous. LD, Lady Bantry's voice faltered. Do you think it's from that man, Miss Marple? Miss Marple looked at the letter for a long moment before answering. Yes, she said softly. And if it is, then I'm afraid, my dear, the danger he speaks of is already much closer than he realizes. The letter sat on the small mahogany table between them, its single sentence seeming to vibrate in the lamplight. Lady Bantry's hands trembled as she reached for her teacup, spilling a drop that darkened the lace cloth. Miss Marple, however, remained very still. Her pale eyes, half shadowed by the lamp, traced the loops and angles of the handwriting, the hurried way the pen had cut into the paper. Fear, not guilt, she thought quietly. This was the hand of a man frightened by what he had learned too late. When Inspector Slack arrived the next morning, summoned by Lady Bantry's nervous telegram, his reaction was one of exasperation thinly disguised as professionalism. Another clue conveniently delivered, he muttered, unfolding the letter with care. He sniffed slightly. Could be a forgery. Could be a distraction. These people, these romantics, they write notes like love confessions and expect us to chase ghosts. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her voice calm. And yet, Inspector, ghosts are often more honest than the living. Slack gave her a sharp look, but she was already leaning closer to the letter. The paper, she noted, was thin and of cheap quality, hotel stationery, perhaps, or borrowed. The ink had run in places, suggesting it was written in haste, possibly in a public room. There was a faint scent of tobacco, foreign, not English-made. Lady Bantry, pale and agitated, insisted she had no idea what it meant. Her husband's old correspondence had long been packed away. Few people even knew his name was still used on formal envelopes. Miss Marple listened carefully. The detail was odd enough to matter. Why send a warning addressed to a dead man? Unless, of course, the writer had meant the letter to reach Lady Bantry herself, knowing she would open anything bearing her late husband's name. The inspector took the letter for evidence, promising to send it for analysis. He then turned his questions toward the village, focusing once more on the vicarage. Miss Marple walked with him as far as the gate, her step measured, her mind quietly working. You see, she said gently, it would be quite inconvenient for someone if Mr. Dane were found alive, wouldn't it? Slack's expression tightened, but he said nothing. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicar and his wife. The parsonage, usually bright with the scent of polish and flowers, felt airless today. The vicar greeted her with weary politeness, his eyes hollow. Mrs. Trent, he explained, had gone to stay with her sister. The poor woman could not bear the stares. Miss Marple offered kind words, but asked, with quiet precision, whether Sylvia had ever mentioned a friend in London named Dane. The vicar hesitated. She did receive letters, he said slowly. I asked about them once. She told me he was a cousin by marriage, a sort of protector after her parents died. He paused, embarrassed by his own uncertainty. I had no reason to doubt her, Miss Marple. She was always secretive about her affairs, but I thought it harmless enough. Miss Marple nodded kindly, though her eyes darkened with thought. Quite so, Vicar. Harmlessness is often a matter of timing, don't you find? He blinked, unsure whether she was asking or observing. On her way back, the air heavy with the scent of damp hedgerows, Miss Marple noticed a small figure walking ahead, a boy of perhaps 12, carrying a fishing pole and whistling a tune she recognized from the garden party. When he noticed her, he stopped and lifted his cap shyly. Afternoon, miss, he said. They told me not to go near the pond, but I saw something queer there this morning. She looked at him kindly. Something queer, Tommy? He nodded, eyes wide. Near the reeds, where they found the lady. There was a glove, a man's glove, brown leather with a button. Miss Marple felt a chill stir through her calm. Did you touch it? He shook his head. No, miss, but I saw the policeman come later and pick it up. Only he didn't take it to the inspector. He gave it to Captain Denham. For a moment she said nothing. Only the faint sound of the wind moved between them. Then she smiled her soft, grandmotherly smile. Thank you, Tommy. You've been very helpful. Do keep to the other side of the garden now, won't you? As she watched the boy disappear into the misty lane, Miss Marple's hand tightened on her walking stick. Somewhere between the broken chain, the letter, and that quiet exchange by the pond, the pattern had changed. What had begun as a tragedy now carried the faint scent of design. And she could feel, in the air of the village, that someone else knew she was beginning to see it too. That evening, the mist thickened into a pale shroud over St. Mary Mead, and the gas lamps along the lanes burned like muted ghosts. From her window at Gossington Hall, Miss Marple could see the faint gleam of the pond through the trees, a silvery patch that seemed almost to pulse with memory. Somewhere beneath that calm surface lay the truth, half buried, half floating, waiting for the right question to stir it loose. Captain Denham dined at the hall that night, his presence excused as an attempt to offer comfort to Lady Bantry, though Miss Marple noticed the faint stiffness in his manner, the way his eyes never quite met anyone's for long. He was a man accustomed to charm being mistaken for sincerity, and perhaps it had worked for him before, but in that quiet dining room, with the weight of death still heavy in the air, his polish began to crack. Lady Bantry, too exhausted to notice, spoke in fragments. Of Sylvia's laughter, of the way she had danced across the terrace last summer, of how cruel it seemed for youth to end so suddenly. Denham murmured polite consolations, though once, when the maid entered to pour the wine, Miss Marple saw his hand tremble as he reached for the glass. It was not grief, she thought, but the kind of trembling that comes when a man realizes control is slipping away. After dinner, as Lady Bantry retired early, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room with Denham. The clock on the mantel ticked softly between them. It must have been dreadful, she said gently, to find oneself suspected when one only wished to be kind. Her voice was so mild, so grandmotherly, that Denham looked up, startled. Suspected? He repeated, forcing a laugh. Good heavens, Miss Marple, the inspector's got no reason, none whatsoever. Oh, quite, she murmured, lowering her eyes. Though, of course, people do talk, and they do notice small things. A missing glove, for instance. The silence that followed was almost imperceptible, but it lingered a heartbeat too long. Denham's smile faltered, just slightly, before he recovered it with professional ease. You shouldn't listen to gossip, Miss Marple. It only leads people astray. Indeed it does, she said softly. "Yet I've often found that what people dismiss as gossip is simply the truth, wearing a different hat." He rose then, too quickly, muttered something about the lateness of the hour, and excused himself. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression unreadable. She waited until the sound of his footsteps faded down the gravel path before standing and crossing to the writing desk. There, she opened the drawer where Lady Bantry had placed the strange letter. The scent of tobacco still clung to it, and beneath it, faintly, a trace of something sharper. Cologne. Not the floral kind a lady might wear, but something foreign, almost medicinal. She drew the paper closer to the lamplight, her fingers light against its edges. Then she noticed it, a faint smudge at the bottom corner, as though a thumb had pressed there. It was not ink, but something darker, with the dull sheen of oil or polish. Leather polish. Her eyes flickered toward the hall where Captain Denham's hat and gloves had been laid out by the butler. One glove, she recalled, had been missing its button. Outside, the rain began again, steady and whispering, like someone knocking softly at the edge of thought. Miss Marple replaced the letter carefully, then went to the window. The mist was rising off the pond in thin white threads, and in the far distance she could see the outline of the constable's lantern moving along the hedge. Somewhere in the quiet, a door closed and the sound echoed faintly, not from the servants' quarters, but from the garden itself. Miss Marple did not move at once. She watched, waited, and then turned toward the corridor, her face thoughtful. Some truths, she knew, did not announce themselves with words or confessions. They crept in quietly, like fog at dusk, until everything familiar began to look different. And tonight, Gossington Hall was no longer a house of mourning. It was a stage, and someone within it had already begun the next act. The sound had been soft, almost tentative, the kind of sound that might have gone unnoticed in a noisier house. But Gossington Hall was not noisy now. It breathed in hushed unease. Miss Marple slipped quietly into the corridor, her slippers making no sound on the old Persian runner. The lamps had been dimmed for the night, leaving the hallway bathed in amber gloom. She moved toward the French doors that opened to the terrace, her instincts guiding her with the precision of habit rather than courage. The air outside was cold and wet. Rain beaded on the terrace stones and shimmered faintly beneath the garden lamps. She stood still for a moment, her eyes adjusting. There, by the yew hedge near the pond, she saw a flicker of movement. A shadow, briefly illuminated by the constable's distant lantern, bent over something on the ground. Then it straightened and vanished into the mist. Miss Marple waited, counting softly under her breath. 1, 2, 3. No sound of footsteps returned, only the faint rustle of leaves and the far-off coo of a wood-pigeon disturbed the silence. Then she stepped back inside and quietly closed the door, her face calm, but her pulse quickened. She did not ring for the servants. There was no need. Whoever had been out there had not come to steal. They had come to retrieve. In the morning, Inspector Slack returned, harried and impatient. His men had searched the grounds again at dawn. The laurel branch Miss Marple had noticed was gone, cut cleanly away, and the constable who had been posted near the pond insisted he'd seen no one in the night. Miss Marple listened without surprise. People saw very little, she thought, when they believed there was nothing left to see. She mentioned the letter again and the scent of foreign tobacco. Slack waved it off. Coincidence, he said. Half the men in London smell like cheap smoke. But when she quietly asked about the glove Tommy had seen, his expression darkened. The glove's missing, he admitted grudgingly. Denham says it was his and that he found it later in his car. Claims he must have dropped it the day before. Miss Marple tilted her head gently. How fortunate, she murmured. Most things lost in this case seem to find their way back to the wrong hands. Slack stared at her, then sighed. You've got something in your head, Miss Marple. I can tell. Out with it. She smiled. Not yet, Inspector. It's a curious thing about puzzles. They dislike being forced. One must let them reveal their corners first. By afternoon, the vicar called, visibly shaken. A note had been delivered to his house that morning, unmarked, unposted, slipped under the door. It contained only 4 words in a hurried scrawl. She knew too much. No signature, no explanation. Miss Marple examined it closely. The writing was different from the first letter, firmer, the lines deliberate, not panicked. This one had been written by someone in control, not someone afraid. As she handed it back, she noticed something that others might have missed, the faint imprint of a pressed petal caught in the fold. A pink rose petal, dry and fragile. There had been roses everywhere at Lady Bantry's garden party. Yet this one, Miss Marple realized, was not from the garden. It carried a faint scent of oil and dust, the kind used in wreath arrangements kept indoors. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the drawing-room fire, her knitting idle in her lap. The flames danced and hissed softly, like whispers from the past. Lady Bantry was upstairs resting, but Miss Marple had asked the maid to leave the door to the terrace unlatched. Sometimes, she reflected, one must let a secret come knocking of its own accord. Outside, the fog thickened again. Footsteps approached, cautious and measured. The latch turned and the door creaked open just an inch. Miss Marple didn't move. The figure slipped inside. Tall coat collar turned up, face half hidden in shadow. She waited until he took one step further, the light catching the rain on his shoulders. "Good evening, Captain Denham," she said softly. He froze. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then he managed a stiff smile. "Couldn't sleep," he said quietly. "Thought I'd check on Lady Bantry. I heard movement earlier." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm, almost approving, though one might think a man who's already retrieved one lost item from the garden would prefer not to lose his way again. His eyes flickered, just briefly, and then the mask returned. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "Oh, I believe you do," she said gently, folding her hands. "But never mind. Truth has a curious way of walking in uninvited, just as you have. The question is whether it leaves again. And with whom?" Denham's mouth tightened. For a moment he looked as though he might speak. Confess, perhaps, but then he simply turned and left, closing the door behind him with a quiet finality. Miss Marple watched the firelight flicker against the brass grate. The pieces were nearly all in place now. Only one thing remained unclear: whether the truth would emerge before someone else, perhaps someone far more innocent, paid the price for keeping it buried. Morning came, with a pale, reluctant light that seemed to hesitate before crossing the windows of Gossington Hall. The rain had ceased, but the world remained damp and heavy, as though the night had left behind a secret it wasn't ready to share. Lady Bantry had breakfast in bed, her appetite gone and her nerves frayed. Miss Marple, however, appeared unusually composed as she sat in the morning room, stirring her tea with slow precision. The scent of damp roses drifted through the open window, mingling with the faint echo of yesterday's unease. Inspector Slack arrived shortly after 9, looking weary but alert. His men had combed the surrounding lanes through the early hours, but there was still no sign of Leonard Dane. He tossed his hat onto the sideboard and muttered that half the village was now whispering about a ghost from London haunting the gardens. Miss Marple listened quietly, her expression unreadable. "A ghost," she said, "is often just a guilty man moving carefully." Slack eyed her suspiciously. "Do you think Dane's still in the area?" "I think," she replied softly, "that he never left." Before the inspector could question her further, the butler appeared at the door, holding an envelope. "Delivered just now, sir," he said, "by a man on a bicycle. No name." Slack took it, tore it open, and frowned. Inside was a single train ticket from Much Benham to London, dated 2 days ago, and beneath it a short message written in the same bold hand as the warning sent to the vicar. He never boarded. Ask the gardener. Slack's eyes narrowed. The gardener. Mr. Ellis, Lady Bantry called weakly from the hall, overhearing. He's been with us for years. A quiet man, keeps to himself. Miss Marple rose gently, smoothing the front of her cardigan. Yes, quite, she murmured. Too quiet, perhaps. Shall we? They found Ellis in the potting shed behind the greenhouse, wiping his hands on a rag. He was a wiry man with sun-worn skin and eyes that darted like a bird's. When he saw the inspector, he stiffened slightly. Something wrong, sir? He asked, too casually. Slack got straight to the point. Where were you on the afternoon of the garden party? Working the lower beds, sir. Didn't leave till after tea. His tone was steady, but Miss Marple noticed the faint tremor in his hand as he set down a trowel. You saw Miss Trent? I saw her pass near the pond. Didn't think much of it. Poor girl, God rest her. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the corner of the shed, where a pair of muddy boots stood drying by the stove. One was slightly torn along the sole, the leather darkened not by mud, but something oilier. She took a delicate step closer, pretending to admire the rows of bulbs hanging to dry. You keep things in very good order, Mr. Ellis, she said kindly. That glove on the shelf there. Is it yours? He turned sharply. No, ma'am, he said after a moment. Found it in the compost heap yesterday. Was going to throw it away. Slack stepped forward, lifting it with a handkerchief. Brown leather, with a missing button. Denham's glove. Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost gentle. Odd, isn't it, that a glove lost before the murder should find its way into your compost heap after it? Almost as though someone wanted to plant it where it would be found. Ellis said nothing. His jaw tightened, and a bead of sweat formed along his temple despite the chill of the shed. Slack pressed him, but he shook his head stubbornly. I didn't kill her, I swear it. I just did what he told me. Miss Marple's knitting bag slipped slightly from her arm as she leaned forward. And who was he, Mr. Ellis? Ellis swallowed, his gaze flicking between them like a trapped animal's. The man from London, he whispered, came to see her that morning. They argued by the greenhouse. He gave me money to deliver a note. Said it was private business. I didn't read it, I swear. But after the girl died, he came back. Told me to burn something he dropped. A handkerchief, I think. And not to speak of it. I burned it that night. Inspector Slack's face hardened. Why didn't you report this? Ellis's voice cracked. Because I was afraid, sir. Afraid of him, and of the captain, too. They were in it together, I think. But I couldn't prove nothing. There was a long silence. Only the faint ticking of rain dripping from the roof filled the shed. Miss Marple looked up, her eyes cool and steady. You've done something very foolish, Mr. Ellis, she said softly, but not unforgivable. Still, I would not like to be in Captain Denham's shoes when he realizes the story has changed hands. Ellis's head dropped into his hands. You'll protect me, miss? Miss Marple's tone was kind, almost motherly. Only the innocent ever truly need protection, she said. Then she turned to the inspector. I believe, dear Mr. Slack, that it's time we invited Captain Denham to take tea at Gossington Hall. It's nearly time, I think, for the truth to stop hiding. The invitation was sent that same afternoon, polite and perfectly worded, as though it were nothing more than a friendly request for conversation. Captain Denham accepted without hesitation, arriving at Gossington Hall just after 4. The rain had lifted, leaving the lawns glistening and the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and roses. From the drawing-room window, Miss Marple watched him approach. The quick, confident stride, the careful tilt of the chin, the mask of composure already in place. It was, she thought, the gait of a man rehearsing innocence. Lady Bantry, though visibly anxious, played her role with fragile grace. She greeted Denham warmly, offered him tea, and gestured for him to sit near the hearth. Inspector Slack stood by the mantel, pretending to admire a painting, though the set of his jaw betrayed the impatience beneath. Miss Marple sat opposite Denham, her knitting needles motionless on her lap, the wool pooling like a waiting net. For a while, the talk was ordinary. Condolences, polite recollections, the familiar rhythms of English restraint. Then Miss Marple looked up, her eyes bright and deceptively gentle. "I've always thought," she began softly, "that guilt shows itself not in words but in what people touch. A letter, for instance, or perhaps a glove." Denham's teacup paused halfway to his lips. The silence in the room deepened. Slack, sensing the shift, moved a step closer. Miss Marple continued, her tone unhurried. "You see, Captain, the gardener was most helpful this morning. He mentioned a man who visited Sylvia before the garden party, a man who gave him money to deliver a note, and who returned later that night to destroy what might have tied him to her death. Very inconveniently, he dropped a glove." Denham set his cup down carefully. His voice, when it came, was low but controlled. "That's absurd. I told the inspector. I lost that glove days before the party." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "And yet it seems to have travelled a rather long way since then. From your car to the compost heap to the gardener's frightened conscience. Curious, isn't it, how objects insist on finding their owners?" His composure cracked, just a hairline fracture, but enough for Slack to see it. The inspector's tone hardened. "Where's Leonard Dane, Captain?" Denham hesitated. "How should I know? He vanished, didn't he?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, quite. Vanished like smoke, though one wonders where smoke goes when the fire is still burning." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting his. "You and Mr. Dane were not strangers, were you? You served together once. And Sylvia Trent, she discovered something, didn't she? Something worth silencing." The room seemed to contract. Denham's hands clenched on his knees. Slack moved closer, but Miss Marple's quiet voice held the moment still. "She found that the man calling himself Leonard Dane was not Leonard Dane at all," she said softly. "He was a name borrowed. From a dead comrade, perhaps. A man whose identity was useful to someone with debts, or perhaps a scandal to hide. Sylvia had the letter that proved it, hidden in her locket. You went to meet her that afternoon to retrieve it, but she refused to give it up." Denham's breath caught, sharp and audible. "You can't know that," he said, his voice hoarse. "Oh, but I do," Miss Marple said gently. "Because when her locket was found, the photograph inside was not of her mysterious suitor, as we all assumed, but of you, younger in uniform, and someone in their haste forgot to remove the other half of that photograph. It was tucked into the gardener's shed this morning, torn and burned at the edges." For a long, heavy moment there was no sound but the ticking of the clock and the faint rustle of rain against the windows. Denham's face had gone pale. His shoulders sagged as though something inside him had finally given way. "It was an accident," he said at last, his voice breaking. "I only meant to frighten her, to take back the letter before she showed it to anyone. She slipped, hit her head, and fell into the pond. I tried to pull her out, I swear I did. But there were people coming. I panicked. I thought if I ran, they'd think it murder." Inspector Slack's pen scratched briskly across his notebook, his jaw tight with grim satisfaction. Miss Marple sighed softly, folding her knitting. "It's a dreadful thing, Captain, how easily panic disguises itself as reason. You might have been forgiven for the truth, you know. But lies," she said gently, "tend to linger far longer than death." As Denham was led away, the room settled into a fragile quiet. Lady Bantry wept softly into her handkerchief. Slack pocketing his notes, muttered something about luck and good guesswork. Miss Marple rose, her expression distant. "Not luck, Inspector," she said. "Just human nature. It never changes. Only the details do." Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The pond lay still under the grey light, its surface unbroken at last. But in Miss Marple's mind, she could still see the faint ripple spreading outward, the echo of a moment born, not of evil, but of weakness. The kind that so often led, in the quiet villages of England, to tragedy disguised as fate. The confession settled like dust after a storm, leaving the drawing-room in a silence that felt almost sacred. The air was heavy with what had been said, and what had not. Inspector Slack had left with Captain Denham in custody, his car rumbling down the wet drive until even the sound of it disappeared into the mist. Lady Bantry sat motionless in her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if the truth itself were something she could still contain if she only held on hard enough. Miss Marple remained by the window. The evening had begun to pale into a soft grey-blue dusk, and the surface of the pond beyond shimmered faintly beneath the thinning fog. She watched it for a long time, her face thoughtful. "Poor Sylvia," she said quietly at last. She was much too young to understand how dangerous innocence can be. Lady Bantry looked up, her eyes red. "Do you really think it was only an accident?" Miss Marple hesitated. "I think Captain Denham believed it was. But I also think that once a man begins to build his life upon deceit, accidents become rather more likely." There was a knock at the door, hesitant, almost timid. It was Withers, the butler, his face pale and anxious. "A message for you, ma'am," he said, extending a folded note. "Delivered by hand just now. A boy brought it." Lady Bantry took it with trembling fingers, but Miss Marple gently intervened. "If you don't mind, my dear," she murmured. She unfolded the note and read it silently, her expression tightening as her eyes moved down the page. It was brief. "You have the wrong man. Look to the water again before night falls." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Lady Bantry gasped. "But Denham confessed." Miss Marple's gaze had drifted back toward the window. "Yes," she said softly. "But confessions are curious things. They tend to reveal only what a person believes about themselves, not always what truly happened." She rose, took her coat and walking stick, and motioned for Withers to fetch a lantern. "If the note is a hoax, it will do no harm to prove it false. But if it isn't—" She let the thought fade. The air outside was cool, the scent of damp grass mingling with the faint sweetness of fallen petals. As they reached the edge of the pond, the constable on duty hurried forward, startled to see them. Miss Marple raised a hand. "Don't trouble yourself, constable. I only wish to look." She knelt by the water's edge, her lantern casting ripples of gold across the dark surface. The lilies shifted, disturbed by the faintest current, and then she saw it. A corner of fabric caught among the reeds. Not pale silk as before, but darker, coarser. She leaned closer, the beam of light revealing something heavy beneath the water. When the constable waded in and lifted it free, Lady Bantry turned away with a cry. It was a man's coat, soaked, torn, and weighted with mud, and in its pocket a small waterlogged wallet bearing the initials L.D. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. "Leonard Dane," she whispered. So the real man was here all along. By the time Inspector Slack returned, the discovery had altered everything. The coroner would confirm later that the body, long submerged, had been dead before Sylvia Trent ever fell into the pond. Denham's borrowed name had not been an invention, but an inheritance. One taken from a man already dead, his body hidden beneath the lilies that had witnessed it all. Miss Marple sat by the fire that night, her knitting silent in her lap once more. The puzzle was complete now, though in its solution lay no triumph, only a quiet sadness. He thought the truth was behind him, she said softly, almost to herself. But the past has a way of waiting patiently. Like the pond, it always reflects in time what's been hidden beneath. Lady Bantry shivered and drew her shawl closer. Do you think anyone will ever really know how it all began? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes half closed. Perhaps not. But it's rather comforting, don't you think, that in the end, the lilies told the truth. Outside, the night deepened. The garden lay still once more, the moon glancing off the pond like a pale eye, half awake. And in the quiet, St. Mary Mead began, slowly, to breathe again. The following morning dawned pale and uncertain, the kind of light that seemed hesitant to touch the world after a night of revelations. Gossington Hall was quiet again, but not with peace, more with the fragile stillness that follows the lifting of a veil. The newspapers had already begun to whisper of scandal. 2 deaths in one pond were bound to stir even the most polite of breakfast tables in St. Mary Mead. Yet for Miss Marple, there remained one small unease that refused to settle. She sat at the writing desk in the morning room, her tea untouched, her gaze on the half-dried lilies visible through the window. Lady Bantry had taken to her bed again, exhausted by what she called the dreadful symmetry of it all. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, had left it first, light, satisfied that his work was done. Captain Denham's confession would stand, he had said. The evidence, even with the discovery of the real Leonard Dane, still tied him too closely to escape the gallows. But Miss Marple, turning the matter over in her quiet mind, felt the faint hum of something incomplete. It was not, she thought, that Denham was innocent. Rather, it was that his guilt did not fit neatly within the borders of what had been found. There were corners unaccounted for, silences that rang too clear, and most of all, there was that note, delivered after his arrest, written by a hand that had known too much. Whoever had sent it had wanted the pond searched again. Why, if the truth was already known? She rose and rang for Withers. "My hat and coat, if you please," she said mildly, "and have the gardener's boy fetch me one of the constables from the village. I think I should like to take another walk by the water." The constable who arrived was young, eager, and faintly uneasy in Miss Marple's presence. She spoke to him gently, as one might to a nervous pupil. They went together down the garden path, the air crisp and still. The pond lay before them, calm once more, its surface reflecting the sky's pale shimmer. She asked the boy to bring a rake, and together they began to draw it lightly through the shallows near the laurel hedge. The constable watched, puzzled, until something soft caught against the teeth of the rake. It was a woman's scarf, faded blue silk, the edges torn. Miss Marple took it carefully, holding it up to the light. The faintest trace of perfume lingered on it, unmistakably the same scent she had caught before on the torn thread from the hedge days ago. "I thought so," she murmured. Poor Sylvia. She struggled here, not by the pond's edge where she was found. Someone moved her afterward. The constable looked startled. "But who, miss?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "Someone who wished the scene to tell a simpler story." She walked back toward the house, her mind knitting threads together with quiet precision. Lady Bantry met her at the threshold, pale but curious. "You've found something again, haven't you?" she asked softly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Something that confirms what I feared. Sylvia Trent did not die by accident. Captain Denham caused her death, yes, but not with his own hands. Someone else was there. Someone who watched and afterward arranged the scene to protect him. Or perhaps themselves." Lady Bantry's eyes widened. "You mean another accomplice?" Miss Marple's expression grew distant. Accomplice is a harsh word. Let us say, another conscience trying to tidy what it could not bear. That afternoon, Miss Marple requested to see the gardener again. Mr. Ellis came to the morning room, hat in hand, his manner deferential. She asked after the laurel hedge, whether he had trimmed it before the party. He said no. Lady Bantry had forbidden it for fear of spoiling the view. And yet, Miss Marple noted, one branch had been cut days ago, not by shears, but with a knife. When she thanked him and dismissed him, she waited only until the door closed before speaking softly to the empty room. "Ah," she said, "so it wasn't Denham who returned that night after all. It was the one person who knew the garden better than anyone, and who could move silently enough not to be noticed." By evening, when Inspector Slack returned for the final paperwork, Miss Marple met him at the door, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. "Inspector," she said mildly, "I think you'll find it was not the captain who placed Miss Trent in the pond. The hands that did it were older, rougher, and quite used to spades. You may want to speak to Mr. Ellis again, though I doubt he'll trouble you long. He's likely halfway to the station by now." Slack stared at her, half exasperated, half in awe. "How the devil do you know these things, Miss Marple?" She smiled gently, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because, Inspector, I've spent most of my life watching people trying to make their sins look tidy, and they never quite succeed." Outside, as dusk fell once more over the gardens, the constables moved quietly among the hedges. The last light touched the pond's surface, turning it briefly to silver before fading into stillness. The lilies swayed, silent witnesses to one more truth brought, reluctantly, to the surface. And Miss Marple, standing at the window with her knitting once again in hand, allowed herself a sigh. Not of triumph, but of quiet understanding. Some gardens, she thought, grow beauty and deceit side by side, and no gardener, however careful, can ever keep them apart. The following day broke clearer than the ones before, the sky washed pale and empty after the long rain. The village, which had lived for a week on whispers and half-truths, had at last fallen into a curious silence, like a room whose gossip has been overheard by the wrong person. But within Gossington Hall, that silence held something heavier than relief. Miss Marple sat in the breakfast-room with Lady Bantry, the newspaper folded untouched beside her plate. The headline spoke of Captain Denham's impending transfer to London for questioning, but it was the smaller print that caught her eye. "Local gardener missing. Police seek man for further inquiry." Lady Bantry sighed, pouring tea with trembling hands. "You were right again, of course. They found his tools gone and his bed unslept in. Oh, Jane, how dreadful it all is. I can hardly bear to think he worked here for 15 years. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Habit makes saints of us all, my dear, until habit turns against conscience." Ellis had grown comfortable here, too comfortable to watch another scandal rise in his employer's garden. Lady Bantry stared into her cup. "Do you really think he killed her?" "Sylvia, I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that he saw something he should not have seen. Perhaps he came upon them quarrelling, the captain and poor Sylvia. Perhaps when she fell, he acted not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear for his position, for your reputation, for what the village would say. He moved her, tidied the scene, and later, when panic returned, he tried to erase what could not be erased." They sat in silence for a time. The clock ticked softly above the mantel. A sparrow fluttered briefly at the window and was gone. Then the front bell rang, a sharp metallic sound that startled them both. Withers appeared moments later. "Inspector Slack, ma'am," he announced gravely. The inspector entered, raincoat in hand, his expression grim but not without admiration. "You were right again, Miss Marple," he said. "We found Ellis halfway to Bristol. He was on the milk train, claimed he only meant to leave quietly, start fresh somewhere no one knew his name. But he talked in the end." Lady Bantry gripped the edge of her chair. "He confessed? Not to murder, to moving the body. Said he heard the captain shouting, saw the girl fall, and thought she was dead. Denham ran, and Ellis panicked. He dragged her to the pond, hoping it would look like an accident. Later, when he realized she had only been unconscious, it was too late. She'd drowned." A long, shivering breath passed through the room. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, her fingers resting lightly against the china cup. "So there it is," she murmured. "A chain of small cowardices, each one fastening neatly to the next until death seemed the tidiest outcome." Slack nodded. "We'll take him to Much Benham for holding. Denham will stand trial, of course. They'll likely call it manslaughter now. Still, it's an ugly business." When he had gone, Lady Bantry rose and walked to the window, her reflection faint against the morning light. "Do you ever tire of being right, Jane?" she asked softly. Miss Marple smiled faintly, though her eyes remained fixed on the lilies outside. "Oh, my dear, being right is very little comfort when it's always over something so terribly wrong." Later that evening, when the last of the constables had gone and the house was finally still, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the garden. The air smelled of wet soil and wood smoke. She stopped by the pond, its surface glassy and pale beneath the rising moon. The lilies floated quietly again, their petals clean, unburdened. She knelt by the edge, her reflection wavering. "It's over now," she said softly, though she wasn't certain to whom she spoke. Perhaps to Sylvia, perhaps to the house itself. People will talk for a time and then they'll forget. That's the mercy of small villages, and the tragedy of them too. A breeze stirred, rippling the water just enough to scatter her reflection. Miss Marple stood, adjusting her shawl, and turned back toward the faint, warm glow of Gossington Hall. Behind her, the pond lay still once more, holding its secrets as gently as it had revealed them. The weeks that followed slipped into an uneasy calm, like a curtain drawn across a stage too quickly. The newspapers lost interest first. London had its own scandals, and the business at Gossington Hall soon faded to a small column beneath advertisements for patent tonics and winter coats. St. Mary Mead, however, did not forget so easily. The villagers spoke of it still, not cruelly, but with that peculiar blend of pity and fascination that thrives and where tragedy has brushed too near. The pond had been drained and cleaned, the lilies replanted, yet even in the brightening autumn air, it seemed to wear an air of quiet remembrance. Miss Marple went about her days much as before, taking tea with the vicar's wife, tending her roses, listening politely when Mrs. Price Ridley insisted that it was all quite obvious from the start. But sometimes, as she sat by her window at dusk, she found her thoughts returning to Ellis, the quiet gardener with his careful manners and frightened eyes. His final statement had come by letter, written from the prison infirmary, where illness had overtaken him before trial. He had confessed not only to moving Sylvia's body, but to knowing, long before, that Captain Denham was not who he claimed to be. "I thought I was protecting my betters," he had written. "I only ever made things worse." Miss Marple had read the letter twice before folding it neatly and tucking it into her writing desk. She had known too many Ellises in her lifetime, good, ordinary souls who mistook silence for loyalty and fear for duty. The world, she thought, was full of such quiet tragedies. One afternoon, some 3 weeks later, Lady Bantry insisted that Miss Marple come to tea in the newly restored garden. The day was unseasonably warm, the air golden with the last light of September. The lawns had been reseeded, the rose beds pruned, and at the pond's edge the lilies floated again, pale, innocent things, their surfaces smooth as glass. "It's strange," Lady Bantry said softly, staring across the water. "I used to think this place was the most peaceful in the world. Now I wonder if anything can ever be truly peaceful again." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Peace is not the absence of memory, my dear, only its acceptance. Gardens recover, and so do people, though never quite the same way." Lady Bantry was silent for a moment, then turned with a faint, wistful smile. "You make it sound almost comforting, Jane. How do you manage to find calm in such dreadful things?" Miss Marple considered. "I think," she said slowly, "it's because dreadful things never surprise me. Human nature is remarkably consistent, even in its cruelties. But sometimes it surprises me in kindness too. As they sat there, the light softened and the first chill of evening crept in. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a blackbird began to sing, hesitant and pure. Lady Bantry reached for her friend's hand, and for a while neither spoke. The garden had fallen quiet again, not with the oppressive silence of guilt, but with something gentler, more forgiving. When Miss Marple rose to leave, she paused by the pond, looking down at her own reflection, trembling among the lilies. The ripples spread outward, slow and silver, until her face blurred into the fading light. "Good night, my dear," Lady Bantry called softly behind her. Miss Marple smiled without turning. "Good night," she said, "and do take care of your garden. It's seen too much truth to be neglected now." She walked home along the lane, her figure small and steady beneath the elm trees. The evening mist gathered low over the fields, and the lights of St. Mary Mead glimmered ahead like patient stars. Behind her, Gossington Hall receded into the twilight, the house once again what it had always been. A quiet English home, standing politely above the secrets that life, in its ordinary way, never quite stops whispering. The end.